The rain was coming down hard that Thursday night, the kind of rain that makes the streetlights blur and the road slick. Judge Tamika Johnson tapped her fingers on the steering wheel as she waited for the traffic light to change. She was tired. The community meeting about youth programs had run longer than expected, and all she wanted now was to get home, kick off her shoes, and maybe catch up on that book she'd been trying to finish for weeks. She changed out of her usual formal courtroom attire hours ago. Now, in her jeans, sneakers, and navy blue sweater with her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, she looked nothing like the respected judge who commanded attention in the county courthouse. That was fine by her. Tamika enjoyed these moments when she could just be herself, away from the weight of her position. The light turned green, and she carefully drove through the intersection. Her mind wandered to tomorrow's cases, a full docket waiting for her. The Hendricks trial was finally wrapping up, and she still needed to review the final arguments. Blue and red lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror, pulling her from her thoughts. Tamika checked her speed. She'd been going exactly at the limit. She signaled and pulled over to the curb, her tires splashing through a puddle as she did so. What now? She muttered to herself, watching in her side mirror as two officers emerged from the patrol car. Both white men, one older with salt and pepper hair visible under his cap, the other younger with broad shoulders. Even through the rain-streaked window, she could see their stern expressions as they approached. Tamika rolled down her window, letting the cool mist of rain hit her face. She kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, a habit she'd learned growing up, reinforced by countless stories from friends and family members. License and registration, the older officer said flatly, not even bothering with a greeting. His nameplate read Reynolds. Behind him stood the younger officer, hand resting near his holster, watching her every move with narrow eyes. His nameplate read Davis. "Good evening, officers," Tamika said calmly. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Officer Reynolds leaned down slightly, shining his flashlight around the inside of her car before answering. "You failed to signal properly back at Pine Street." Tamika knew that wasn't true. She always signaled. It was automatic to her. But she'd been a judge long enough to know this wasn't the time to argue. "I'm sorry about that. I thought I had. Where are you coming from this time of night?" Officer Davis chimed in, his tone suggesting there weren't many legitimate places a black woman should be coming from after dark. "A community meeting at the Westside Center," she replied, keeping her voice even. "I volunteer with their youth program." The officers exchanged glances that made Tamika's stomach tighten. She'd seen that look before, in her courtroom, when officers thought they'd caught someone in a lie. "Pretty fancy car for a volunteer," Reynolds remarked, running his hand along the edge of her car door. Her 3-year-old sedan was hardly fancy, but she didn't correct him. "License and registration, ma'am," he repeated, more forcefully this time. "Of course." Tamika reached slowly toward the glove compartment. "I'm just getting my registration from the glove box, and then I'll get my license from my purse." As she pulled out the papers, she noticed Officer Davis had stepped back slightly, his posture tense. It struck her how differently this routine traffic stop felt from the driver's seat compared to how she'd heard it described countless times in her courtroom. She handed over her documents, and Reynolds squinted at them under his flashlight. "Tamika Johnson, this your current address?" "Yes, sir." "What kind of work do you do, Miss Johnson?" Davis asked, emphasizing the Ms. in a way that made it sound less like respect and more like an assumption. For a split second, Tamika considered telling them she was a judge. It would change everything about this interaction. She'd seen it happen before when officers realized they were dealing with someone with authority. But something held her back. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the principle of the thing. Why should her treatment depend on her title? "I work in the legal field," she said simply. "Legal field, huh?" Reynolds smirked. "Paralegal or something." "Something like that," she replied, not correcting his assumption. Reynolds handed her license to Davis, who walked back to their patrol car, presumably to run her information. The rain was coming down harder now, but Reynolds made no move to hurry the process or retreat to the shelter of his vehicle. "You know, we get a lot of problems in this neighborhood," he said, his eyes scanning her car again. "Drugs coming through, mostly. People who don't live here, coming where they don't belong." Tamika lived just 3 blocks away. This was very much her neighborhood. I understand, she said, not wanting to provoke him. But I assure you, I'm just heading home after a long day. Reynolds nodded, but his expression showed he wasn't convinced. Mind if I ask, do you have anything in this vehicle I should know about? No, sir, she replied, feeling a familiar frustration building inside her. This wasn't about a missed turn signal anymore, if it ever had been. Davis returned, leaning in to whisper something to Reynolds. Both glanced at her with renewed suspicion. Step out of the car, please, Miss Johnson, Reynolds said, his hand now resting on his belt. May I ask why that's necessary? This was just about a turn signal, wasn't it? Tamika kept her voice level despite her rising concern. Ma'am, when an officer gives you a lawful order, you need to comply, Davis said, his voice taking on an edge. Step out of the vehicle now. Tamika knew her rights. She also knew how quickly these situations could escalate. With measured movements, she unclipped her seatbelt. As she did, she discreetly pressed the record button on her phone's audio app, a habit she'd developed years ago, never thinking she'd need to use it herself. The rain soaked through her sweater almost immediately as she stepped out into the night. The two officers towered over her 5'4" frame, both standing too close for comfort. Now, Miss Johnson, Reynolds said, his voice carrying that false politeness that she'd heard so many times in testimony, why don't you tell us what you're really doing out here tonight? Standing on the wet roadside, surrounded by the flashing lights that illuminated the raindrops like falling stars, Tamika realized this traffic stop was about to become much more than she'd bargained for. But as scared as she was becoming, another part of her, the judge, the defender of justice, was paying careful attention to every word, every procedural misstep, every assumption these officers were making. Whatever happened next, she would remember it all. The rain seemed to grow heavier as Tamika stood on the roadside, water seeping into her sneakers. She could feel her socks getting soaked, a small discomfort compared to the situation unfolding around her. The patrol car's lights cast alternating red and blue shadows across the wet pavement, turning ordinary raindrops into something almost otherworldly. I told you, Officer Reynolds, she said, working to keep her voice steady. I'm coming from a community meeting at the Westside Center and heading home. It's just 3 blocks from here. Officer Reynolds circled her like a shark, his boots splashing in the puddles. The thing is, Ms. Johnson, we've had reports of drug activity in this area. People who match your description. People who match my description. Tamika repeated, her heart beating faster though her voice remained calm. And what description would that be exactly? The younger officer, Davis, stepped forward. Don't get smart. He means people driving through who don't belong here. Tamika took a deep breath, feeling rainwater trickle down the back of her neck. I've lived in this neighborhood for 8 years, Officer Davis. This is very much where I belong. Reynolds and Davis exchanged looks again. Tamika had seen that same look countless times in her courtroom, officers silently communicating their disbelief of a defendant's story. Only now she was on the receiving end of that doubt. Mind if we take a look in your car? Reynolds asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a question. Actually, I do mind, Tamika said, standing her ground despite the rain plastering her sweater to her skin. Unless you have probable cause, I don't consent to a search of my vehicle. Davis's expression hardened. You a lawyer or something? I told you I work in the legal field, she replied, choosing her words carefully. Well, your reluctance to cooperate is making us suspicious, Reynolds said, his hand moving to rest on his belt near his handcuffs. People with nothing to hide don't usually refuse a simple vehicle check. Tamika felt a flash of indignation. That's not how our legal system works, officer. Refusing a search is my constitutional right. It doesn't indicate guilt. Look at that, Tom, Davis said to his partner with a smirk. We got ourselves a sidewalk constitutional expert. Reynolds stepped closer, using his height to tower over her. Let me explain something to you. It's nearly midnight. You're in an area known for drug trafficking. You failed to use proper signals. And now you're being uncooperative with law enforcement. That builds a picture, Ms. Johnson. The unfairness of it all made Tamika's chest tight. In her courtroom, she would have shut down this kind of faulty reasoning immediately. Evidence mattered there, not hunches and certainly not bias. But out here in the rain, her gavel held no power. "I've answered all your questions truthfully," she said. "I've provided my license and registration. If you're issuing me a citation for allegedly failing to signal, I'll accept that. But I don't consent to any searches without a warrant." Officer Davis stepped uncomfortably close. "You know what people from this neighborhood are like, Tom. Always giving us trouble, always thinking they know the law better than we do." The comment hung in the air between them. Tamika felt a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. Her phone was still recording in her pocket, capturing every word. "What do you mean by people from this neighborhood?" she asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. Reynolds ignored her question. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood of your car, please." "Am I under arrest?" Tamika asked, standing perfectly still despite the rain pelting her face. "Not yet," Davis said, his hand now resting on his handcuffs. "But you're being detained while we sort this out." "On what grounds am I being detained?" Tamika pressed, knowing full well they were overstepping. "Obstruction," Reynolds snapped. "You're interfering with our investigation." "By asserting my rights? That's not obstruction, Officer Reynolds, and you know it," Tamika said, her judicial composure beginning to crack under the weight of this injustice. Davis stepped forward, grabbing her arm. "Hands on the car. Now." The touch sparked something in Tamika, not fear, but resolve. This was exactly the type of police behavior she'd heard described in her courtroom. The type some of her colleagues dismissed as exaggeration. There would be no dismissing this. "I'm not resisting," she said clearly, making sure her phone caught her words as she slowly turned and placed her hands on the wet hood of her car. "I'm complying under protest." The cold metal of handcuffs closed around her wrists with a decisive click. The sensation was surreal. After years of ordering them for others, she was now feeling their bite herself. "Tamika Johnson, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest," Reynolds announced, pulling her hands behind her back perhaps a bit more roughly than necessary. "Resisting arrest?" Tamika couldn't hold back her disbelief. "I've complied with every lawful order. I haven't resisted in any way." "You can tell it to the judge," Davis said with a smirk. The irony of his statement almost made Tamika laugh despite everything, if only he knew. As they led her toward the patrol car, her neighbors began to notice the commotion. Porch lights flicked on. Faces appeared in windows. Mrs. Wilson, the retired schoolteacher who lived on the corner, came out onto her porch in a bathrobe, watching with concern as they placed Tamika in the back seat. "You okay, honey?" Mrs. Wilson called out, her voice cutting through the rain. "I'm fine, Mrs. Wilson," Tamika called back, trying to sound calmer than she felt. "Can you call my sister?" "Tell her to meet me at the central precinct." The patrol car door slammed shut before she could say more. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched her neighborhood, her home, disappear as they drove away. Her clothes were soaked, her wrists were starting to ache from the tight handcuffs, and her mind was racing. Sitting in the back of the police car, Tamika made a decision. She wouldn't reveal her identity yet. Not until she saw how far this would go. Not until she witnessed firsthand the full extent of what ordinary citizens faced when officers like Reynolds and Davis decided they were guilty before even knowing who they were. As a judge, she'd always prided herself on her fairness, on giving everyone in her courtroom the benefit of proper procedure. Tonight, she was getting a harsh lesson in how quickly those procedures could be set aside on a rainy street corner, away from the watching eyes of the courthouse. The rain continued to pour as they headed toward the precinct, and Tamika Johnson, judge of the County Superior Court, sat silently in the back seat, just another arrested black woman to the officers in the front. For now, the ride to the precinct was uncomfortably silent. Tamika sat in the back seat of the patrol car, the plastic covering sticking to her wet clothes. Every pothole sent a jolt of pain through her shoulders as the tight handcuffs dug into her wrists. She watched the familiar streets of her neighborhood fade away, replaced by the downtown lights reflecting off puddles in the rainy night. Officer Reynolds drove while Davis typed something into the computer mounted on the dashboard. Occasionally, they would exchange glances or mutter something too quiet for her to hear. The wipers squeaked rhythmically against the windshield, marking time as Tamika considered her situation. She could end this now, one sentence. "I'm Judge Tamika Johnson," and everything would change. Their attitudes would transform instantly. The handcuffs would come off. Apologies would flow freely. but something kept her silent. Maybe it was the 23-year-old woman who'd appeared in her courtroom last month, arrested under similar circumstances, but without the power or position to make officers think twice. Maybe it was the countless testimonies she'd heard from people in her community about interactions gone wrong. Or maybe it was simply that she wanted to see this through, to experience firsthand what happened when you were just another name in the system. The patrol car pulled into the underground garage of the Central Precinct. The fluorescent lights were harsh after the darkness of the rainy night. Officer Davis opened her door. "Let's go," he said, helping her out of the car with a grip that was neither gentle nor particularly rough, just procedural, impersonal. They led her through a service entrance and into a processing area. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Several officers milled about, some looking up briefly as she was brought in before returning to their paperwork or conversations. Just another arrest on a busy night. "Sit here," Reynolds instructed, pointing to a bench attached to the wall. "Officer Chen will process you in a minute." Tamika sat, her handcuffs still on, her clothes still damp. Across from her, a man who smelled strongly of alcohol was arguing with another officer about why he'd been brought in. Two young women sat further down the bench, whispering to each other. Normal night at Central Precinct. An officer approached with a clipboard, a woman with short gray hair and tired eyes that had seen it all. "Name?" she asked, not even looking up from her form. "Tamika Johnson," she replied. "Address?" Tamika gave her address, the same one that was on her license. The booking officer, whose nameplate read Chen, continued through the standard questions mechanically. "Occupation?" Tamika paused. This was the moment. She could still tell the truth and end this charade. But the recording in her pocket was valuable. The experience was valuable. And she needed to see this through. "I work in the county courthouse," she said simply, not a lie. Officer Chen nodded without interest and continued down her list. Date of birth, emergency contact, basic health questions. When she finished, she called over to Reynolds and Davis. "What are the charges on this one?" Reynolds approached, standing tall as if to emphasize the importance of this arrest. "Obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, and failure to signal." "That's quite a list for a traffic stop," Chen commented, her tone suggesting this wasn't the first time she'd seen simple violations escalate. "She was uncooperative," Davis added. "Refused a vehicle search, started quoting laws at us." Ken raised an eyebrow but said nothing, turning back to Tamika. "Empty your pockets, please." Officer Reynolds stepped forward to remove the handcuffs temporarily. Tamika winced as the blood rushed back into her hands. Carefully, she pulled out her phone, keys, and wallet. She placed them in the plastic bin Chen held out. Chen picked up the wallet, opening it to verify the ID matched what Tamika had told her. As she flipped it open, something fell out. Tamika's courthouse ID badge with the gold seal of the county and the word JUBGE printed in bold letters across the top. The badge landed face up on the desk. For 3 long seconds, nobody spoke. Officer Chen looked from the badge to Tamika, her professional composure cracking for the first time. Reynolds and Davis hadn't noticed yet, still filling out their paperwork. "Officers," Chen said, her voice suddenly different. "You might want to take a look at this." Reynolds glanced up, annoyed at the interruption. "What?" Chen held up the badge. "Do you know who you arrested tonight?" Davis stepped closer, squinting at the ID. His face went through a remarkable transformation, confusion, disbelief, and then something close to horror. "That can't be right," he mumbled. Reynolds snatched the badge, staring at it and then at Tamika as if seeing her for the first time. "You're Judge Johnson, the Judge Johnson." The buzz of conversation in the processing room died down as heads turned toward them. Tamika stood up straight, no longer the compliant arrestee, but every inch the respected judge who commanded attention in her courtroom. "Yes, Officer Reynolds, the same Judge Johnson who presides over most of the cases from your precinct." Her voice was calm but carried throughout the now silent room. "The same Judge Johnson who you claimed was acting suspiciously by driving home in her own neighborhood." Lieutenant Garcia, who had been working at a desk across the room, hurried over. He was a veteran officer who had testified in Tamika's courtroom dozens of times. His face paled when he recognized her. "Judge Johnson, what on earth?" He turned to Reynolds and Davis. What is going on here? Both officers had lost their authoritative postures. Reynolds was the first to speak. It was a traffic stop, sir. It escalated. Escalated? Garcia looked horrified. You arrested a county judge on a traffic violation. She didn't identify herself as a judge, Davis said weakly. Tamika raised an eyebrow. Should I need to, Officer Davis? Do citizens without a title not deserve the same respect and presumption of innocence? The question hung in the air. Officers who had been pretending not to listen were now openly watching the scene unfold. The man who had been arguing earlier was suddenly silent, a look of amazement on his face. Garcia turned to Tamika, professionalism battling with embarrassment. Judge Johnson, I want to personally apologize for this misunderstanding. We'll have you released immediately, of course. Is that what this is, Lieutenant? A misunderstanding? Tamika asked, her voice level but firm. Or is it a glimpse into how certain officers conduct themselves when they think nobody's watching? When they think the person they're arresting has no power to hold them accountable? She reached for her phone in the bin. I have an audio recording of the entire interaction. Perhaps the department would be interested in hearing how these officers speak to residents of what they called that neighborhood. Reynolds and Davis exchanged looks of pure panic. The other officers in the room seemed to be holding their breath. This isn't over, Tamika said, gathering her belongings with dignity despite her still damp clothes. But I think we can all agree that the charges will be dropped. Garcia nodded quickly. Of course, Your Honor. And there will be a full investigation into the conduct of these officers. As Tamika prepared to leave, the reality of what had just happened settled over the precinct. The mighty had fallen, the tables had turned, and every person in that room knew they had just witnessed something that would change things forever. And Tamika Johnson, still dignified despite everything, walked toward the exit, already thinking about how this night could transform not just two officers' careers, but perhaps the entire department's approach to the community they served. Tamika stepped out of the precinct into the night air. The rain had stopped, but puddles still reflected the streetlights, making the wet pavement glitter like black glass. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what had just happened settling on her shoulders. Her sister Diane was waiting outside, leaning against her car with her arms crossed. One look at Tamika's face, and Diane rushed forward. My God, what happened to you? She asked, taking in Tamika's damp clothes and the red marks on her wrists where the handcuffs had been too tight. It's a long story, Tamika said, her voice tired but determined. Can we talk about it at my place? The drive home was filled with Diane's questions and Tamika's measured responses. She explained about the traffic stop, the escalation, the arrest, all while Diane's expressions shifted from shock to anger to disbelief. And they had no idea who you were. The whole time, Diane asked as they pulled into Tamika's driveway. Not until they'd processed me at the station, Tamika answered, unlocking her front door. The familiar comfort of her home had never felt so welcoming. You should have seen their faces when my courthouse ID fell out of my wallet. Inside, Tamika changed into dry clothes while Diane made tea in the kitchen. When she returned to the living room, Diane was sitting on the couch with two steaming mugs, her face serious. What are you going to do now? She asked, handing a mug to Tamika. Tamika wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, considering the question. I'm not sure yet, but I know I can't just let this go. You could sue them, Diane suggested. Make a huge case out of it. It would be all over the news. Tamika shook her head. This isn't about money or headlines for me. This is about something bigger. She reached for her phone and played the audio recording she'd captured during the traffic stop. The officers' voices filled the quiet living room, their assumptions, their condescension, the clear bias in how they treated her. How many people does this happen to every day? Tamika asked when the recording ended. People who don't have a judge's badge to pull out? People who don't know their rights or are too afraid to assert them? Diane was quiet for a moment. So what will you do? Before Tamika could answer, her phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Chief Williams, the head of the police department. News traveled fast. Judge Johnson, the chief said when she answered, his voice formal but strained. I've just been briefed about tonight's incident. I want to personally apologize for the conduct of my officers. Thank you, Chief, Tamika replied, keeping her voice neutral. But I think this situation requires more than just an apology. Of course, he said quickly. Officers Reynolds and Davis have been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. I can assure you. Chief, Tamika interrupted. I appreciate those steps, but I'm more concerned with the systemic issues this reveals than with the two officers involved. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What exactly are you suggesting, Judge Johnson? I'm not suggesting anything tonight, she said firmly. But I will be in your office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. with the full recording of my interaction with your officers. I think we need to have a serious conversation about patterns of behavior and community relations. After she hung up, Diane looked at her with a mixture of pride and concern. You're really going after the whole system, aren't you? Someone has to, Tamika said simply. The next morning arrived with clear skies that gave no hint of the previous night's storm. Tamika dressed carefully in her most professional suit, the one she wore for high-profile cases. The navy blue jacket and skirt projected authority and seriousness. She pinned her judge's badge to her lapel, visible for all to see. The police department headquarters was a flurry of activity when she arrived. Word had spread about what had happened, and officers glanced at her with curious or wary expressions as she made her way to the chief's office. Chief Williams was waiting for her, along with the department's legal counsel and the deputy chief. The atmosphere in the room was tense as Tamika took her seat across from them. Judge Johnson, Chief Williams began, his hands folded on the desk in front of him. Again, I want to extend my deepest. I think we've covered the apologies, Chief, Tamika said. I'd like to move on to solutions. She placed her phone on the desk between them and played the full recording. The room was painfully silent as they listened to Officers Reynolds and Davis make assumptions about people from this neighborhood and escalate a simple traffic stop into an arrest based on nothing more than Tamika asserting her rights. When the recording ended, the legal counsel looked particularly pale. The deputy chief was staring at his notepad, unable to meet Tamika's eyes. This is obviously concerning, the chief said, breaking the silence. But I want to assure you that these officers don't represent the department as a whole. Don't they? Tamika asked quietly. Because in my courtroom, Chief Williams, I've heard similar stories from dozens of citizens. The only difference is that most of them don't have recordings to back up their claims, and many don't have the legal knowledge to articulate exactly how their rights were violated. The deputy chief cleared his throat. What would you like us to do, Judge Johnson? Tamika leaned forward. First, I want a complete review of all arrests made by Officers Reynolds and Davis over the past year, with special attention to any patterns in who they're stopping and how those stops escalate. She held up her hand when the legal counsel started to object. Second, I want to establish a community oversight committee with real power to review complaints against officers. And third, I want mandatory bias training for every officer in this department, not just a one-time seminar, but ongoing education. Judge Johnson, the chief said carefully, some of those requests would require approval from the city council and the mayor's office. It's not as simple as, I'm having lunch with the mayor next week, Tamika interrupted. And as for the city council, I think they'll be very interested in this recording if the department chooses not to take appropriate action. The three men exchanged glances. Tamika could see them calculating the political and public relations disaster that would unfold if her story and recording went public. We want to work with you on this, the chief finally said. But I hope you understand there are procedures we need to follow regarding the officers involved. I do understand procedures, Chief Williams, Tamika said with a hint of steel in her voice. I ensure they're followed every day in my courtroom. All I'm asking is that the same standards of justice apply to everyone, including your officers. As they began discussing the details of how to move forward, Tamika felt a strange mix of emotions. There was anger still, yes, at the injustice she experienced and that so many others faced without recourse. But there was also a sense of purpose. Her position as a judge had always given her power within the courthouse walls. Now she had an opportunity to extend that influence to create change where it was desperately needed. By the time she left the police headquarters, the first steps of a plan were in place. The news hadn't broken publicly yet, but it would soon. And when it did, Tamika Johnson would be ready, not as a victim seeking vengeance, but as a force for accountability and change in a system that had for too long operated in the shadows. As she walked to her car, an officer she didn't recognize held the door for her. "Judge Johnson," he said with a respectful nod. She nodded back, wondering if he would have been so polite if she'd been wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her judge's robes, if he'd met her on a rainy street corner instead of at police headquarters. These were the questions that would drive her forward in the days to come. By noon the next day, the story had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Tamika arrived for her regular docket to find hushed conversations stopping as she walked by. Courthouse staff, attorneys, and even other judges watched her with a mixture of curiosity, respect, and in some cases, discomfort. "All rise," the bailiff called as Tamika entered her courtroom. She took her place at the bench, surveying the room. There were more spectators than usual today. News traveled fast in legal circles. She recognized several senior attorneys who didn't have cases on today's docket sitting in the back row, clearly there to observe. "Be seated," she said, her voice carrying the same authority it always had. "We have a full calendar today, so let's proceed efficiently." As she worked through the morning cases, Tamika maintained her usual fair and thoughtful approach. She didn't rush or show any sign that the previous night's events had affected her professional demeanor. But she couldn't help noticing how the police officers testifying today seemed unusually nervous, their eyes avoiding hers. During the lunch recess, her clerk Lisa approached her desk with a concerned expression. "Judge Johnson, there are several reporters waiting outside. They're asking for statements about what happened last night." Tamika sighed. She had expected this, but not quite so quickly. "Who told them?" "I'm not sure," Lisa said, "but the story's already online. Channel 8 is calling it Judge Justice, about how you were wrongfully arrested in your own neighborhood." Tamika shook her head. Of course they're sensationalizing it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Robert Taylor, the district attorney. "Need to talk ASAP about Reynolds/Davis situation." Before she could respond, Lisa added, "And Judge Wilson wants to see you in his chambers when you have a moment." Judge Wilson was the chief judge for the county, a position he'd held for nearly 15 years. His invitation wasn't really optional. Tamika found him waiting behind his large oak desk, his expression grave. At 72, with silver hair and 40 years on the bench, he commanded respect throughout the legal community. "Tamika," he said, gesturing to a chair, "I've heard about your experience last night. Troubling, to say the least." "Yes, it was," she agreed, taking the offered seat. "The mayor called me this morning," Wilson continued, "and the police chief. Everyone's concerned about how this will play out publicly." Tamika felt a flicker of irritation. "I'm more concerned about how these situations play out for people who don't have my position, Judge Wilson." He nodded slowly. "That's what makes this particularly important. You have a platform now. A spotlight. The question is, how will you use it?" "I've already requested a review of the officers' past arrests and mandatory bias training for the department," she said. "Good steps," Wilson acknowledged. "But this could be bigger than just those two officers or even that precinct. This could spark a broader conversation about policing in our community." Tamika studied the older judge. She had always respected Wilson, but had sometimes found him too cautious, too concerned with maintaining the status quo. His words now surprised her. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. "I'm suggesting that you have a unique opportunity here. You experienced what many citizens in our community face, but you have the credibility and position to actually be heard. Don't let this become just another news cycle scandal that fades away." Wilson leaned forward. "The Judicial Ethics Committee is meeting next week. I'd like you to present your experience and recommendations. We could establish new guidelines for how cases involving potential police misconduct are handled throughout the county court system." Tamika hadn't expected this level of support. That would be significant. It would, Wilson agreed. But handle the media carefully. This isn't about personal vindication, it's about systemic change. When she left Wilson's chambers, Tamika had a lot to consider. The reporters were still waiting outside, but she took a back exit to avoid them for now. She needed to think. That evening, she invited the leaders of several community organizations to her home, the director of the West Side Center where she volunteered, the head of the neighborhood association, and 3 others who had been working on police-community relations for years. They sat in her living room, sharing their reactions to her story and, more importantly, their ideas for how to use this moment effectively. "The problem," said Tina Washington from the Neighborhood Association, "is that these stories usually get attention only when they happen to someone prominent. We need to make sure this shines a light on everyone's experiences, not just yours." "I agree," Tamika said. "That's why I want to create a platform for others to be heard." James Donovan, who ran a youth mentor program, leaned forward. "The officers will probably get some kind of discipline, maybe even fired. But that's not enough. The whole culture needs to change." "Exactly," said Tamika. "And that's where I think we can make a difference. I've been thinking about establishing a community review board with actual authority. Not just making recommendations, but having real input into police training, policies, and discipline." They talked for hours, developing a comprehensive plan. By the time everyone left, Tamika had pages of notes and a clear vision for moving forward. The next morning, she finally agreed to speak to the press. Rather than giving individual interviews, she held a brief press conference on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed as she approached the microphones. She could see Officers Reynolds and Davis's faces plastered on newspapers at the media stand nearby, alongside her own courtroom photo. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady. "As many of you have reported, 2 nights ago I was wrongfully arrested during a routine traffic stop in my own neighborhood. While this experience was personally troubling, I'm not here to talk about just my story." The reporters leaned in, sensing this wasn't going to be the angry denunciation they'd expected. "Every day in my courtroom, I hear similar accounts from citizens who don't have the benefit of a judge's badge to protect them. People who are assumed guilty because of how they look or where they live. My experience has simply confirmed what many in our community have been saying for years." She outlined the initial steps being taken: the investigation into the officers, the review of their past arrests, the bias training. But then she went further. "Today, I'm announcing the formation of the Community Justice Partnership, a collaboration between legal professionals, community leaders, and the police department. This won't be just another committee that makes recommendations that gather dust. This will be a working partnership with real authority to create change." A reporter called out, "Judge Johnson, are you calling for the officers who arrested you to be fired?" Tamika paused, knowing her answer would set the tone for everything that followed. "This isn't about punishment for 2 officers. This is about accountability for an entire system. Those officers will have due process, just as everyone who comes before my bench deserves. What matters is not what happens to them specifically, but what we learn and how we improve going forward." Another shattered question. "Are you planning to sue the department?" "No," she said firmly. "I'm planning to work with them. Change doesn't come from lawsuits and settlements with confidentiality agreements. It comes from honest conversations, new perspectives, and real commitment to doing better." As the questions continued, Tamika maintained her balance between acknowledging the injustice she'd experienced and focusing on the broader issues. She wasn't playing the victim or seeking revenge. She was using her position to shine light on a problem that affected her entire community. When she finished, Judge Wilson was waiting at the top of the courthouse steps. He nodded his approval as she approached. "Well done," he said quietly. "You've given them something more important than a scandal. You've given them a story about solutions." Tamika looked back at the dispersing reporters, some already typing furiously on their phones to get the story out. "Let's hope it's a story that leads to real change," she replied. As she walked into the courthouse to begin her day on the bench, Tamika knew that the hardest work was still ahead. Headlines would fade. Public interest would wane, but she was now committed to a path that had been revealed to her through one rainy night and a case of mistaken judgment. Sometimes, she reflected, justice came from the most unexpected circumstances. 2 weeks passed in a blur of meetings, interviews, and regular court duties for Tamika. The story had made national news for a few days before being replaced by other headlines, but locally, the conversation continued. Letters to the editor filled the newspaper. Community forums were packed with people sharing their own experiences with police. The mayor had publicly committed to reform, though how sincere that commitment was remained to be seen. Today was the disciplinary hearing for Officers Reynolds and Davis. Tamika wouldn't be part of the panel. That would be a clear conflict of interest. But she had been asked to testify about what happened that night. The hearing room was in the city administration building, a sterile space with fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable chairs. Tamika sat outside, waiting to be called in. She could hear muffled voices through the door as the proceedings began without her. A young woman sat down beside her, nervously twisting a tissue in her hands. "Are you here for the hearing too?" the woman asked. Tamika nodded. "Yes. Are you?" "I'm going to testify." The woman looked down at her hands. "My name's Alicia. Officer Reynolds arrested me last year. Same thing. Traffic stop that shouldn't have been anything but turned into charges. I lost my job because of it." Tamika felt a wave of emotion, a mixture of anger and validation. "I'm sorry that happened to you. When I heard about your case, I called that number they set up for complaints about these officers. I didn't think anyone would care about my story, but they asked me to come in." Alicia shook her head in disbelief. "Never thought I'd see the day." Before Tamika could respond, the door opened and a clerk called her name. As she stood, Alicia touched her arm. "Thank you," she said simply, "for making people listen." The hearing room was arranged like a small courtroom. 3 senior police officials sat at a table at the front, 2 men and a woman, all in formal uniform. To one side sat Officers Reynolds and Davis with their union representative. On the other side was the department's internal affairs investigator who was presenting the case against them. Both officers looked up when Tamika entered. Davis quickly looked away, but Reynolds held her gaze for a moment. His expression wasn't angry as she might have expected, but something more complicated, perhaps shame, perhaps resignation. Tamika was sworn in and asked to describe what had happened that night. She spoke clearly and factually, without embellishment. The recording was played again, those same words that had shocked the chief and his deputies 2 weeks ago now filling this room. When the recording ended, the female officer on the panel, Captain Rivera, according to her nameplate, leaned forward. "Judge Johnson, in your experience, was there any legitimate reason for the officers to escalate this traffic stop to an arrest?" "No," Tamika said firmly. "I provided my license and registration as requested. I was not intoxicated or threatening. I simply questioned why I needed to exit my vehicle and asserted my right to refuse a search without probable cause." The union representative spoke up. "But you didn't identify yourself as a judge. Don't you think that would have prevented the misunderstanding?" Tamika met his eyes steadily. "My occupation shouldn't matter. Every citizen has the same rights under the law. The misunderstanding, as you call it, wasn't about who I was. It was about the assumptions these officers made based on how I looked and where I was driving." After she finished testifying, Tamika was told she could stay or leave as she preferred. She chose to stay, moving to the public seating area at the back of the room. She wanted to hear Alicia's testimony and the others who had come forward. Alicia spoke next, her voice gaining strength as she described her experience. After her came a young man named Devin, who had been stopped while jogging in the same neighborhood. Then an older gentleman, Mr. Patterson, who had been handcuffed while unloading groceries because someone reported a suspicious person at his own home. One by one, they told their stories. Different details, different days, but the same pattern. The same officers. The same assumptions. The same escalation over minor issues or nothing at all. By late afternoon, the testimony had ended, and the panel asked Reynolds and Davis to speak for themselves. Officer Davis went first, reading from notes he prepared. "I joined the force to protect and serve," he began, his voice tight. "I never intended to cause harm or distress to members of the public. If my actions have done so, I apologize." It felt rehearsed, empty, the kind of apology written by someone else. Tamika could see that the panel wasn't impressed either. Then it was Reynolds' turn. The older officer took a deep breath and set aside the paper his representative had given him. "I've been on the force for 17 years, he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Started when I was 23. I was taught by officers who learned in a different time, and I guess I've been doing things the way they showed me." He looked directly at Tamika for the first time. "Hearing all these stories today, hearing what it sounds like on that recording, I don't like the officer I heard. I don't want to be that person." The room was silent, everyone waiting to see if his apparent remorse was genuine or just a show for the panel. "I'm not asking to keep my job," Reynolds continued, surprising everyone. "I'm just asking for the chance to make this right somehow, to learn and do better, whether that's on the force or somewhere else." After both officers had spoken, the panel announced they would deliberate privately and issue their decision the following day. As people began to leave, Tamika found herself facing Reynolds in the hallway. "Judge Johnson," he said quietly, "I want you to know, what I said in there wasn't just for them. I meant it." Tamika studied his face, looking for insincerity but finding none. "I believe you do mean it now," she said finally. "The question is what you'll do with that realization going forward." He nodded, understanding that she wasn't offering easy forgiveness. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want to be part of fixing this. I've got nephews growing up in this city. I don't want them living in a place where people fear the police." Tamika thought about the community justice partnership she was forming. If you're serious, there might be a way. Not as an officer, at least not right away, but as someone who understands the problem from the inside. The next day, the panel's decision was announced. Both officers would be terminated for multiple violations of department policy. However, in an unusual move, they would be offered the option of participating in the new community outreach and police reform initiative being established. That evening, Tamika met with her growing team at the West Side Center. Community leaders, legal experts, former officers who supported reform, and now, unexpectedly, Officer Reynolds had all gathered to outline their approach. "We need to be clear about our goals," Tamika said, addressing the diverse group. "This isn't just about punishing bad behavior. It's about preventing it from happening in the first place." Tina from the Neighborhood Association nodded. "We need better training for officers, but also better understanding from the community about how to safely interact with police. And real consequences when things go wrong," added Mr. Patterson, who had testified at the hearing. No more looking the other way. Reynolds sat quietly for most of the meeting, listening more than speaking. When he finally did contribute, his words carried the weight of someone seeing clearly for the first time. "The Academy taught us about laws and procedures," he said, "but nobody ever really taught us how to see people as people first, not as potential threats or suspects. That's where we need to start." As the meeting concluded, Tamika felt a cautious sense of hope. The path ahead wasn't clear or easy, but for the first time, all the necessary voices were in the room together, not shouting at each other, but actually listening. On her way out, Alicia stopped her again. "I saw the news about the officers being fired, but then I heard they might work with your group. Is that true?" Tamika could see the confusion and hint of betrayal in the younger woman's eyes. "Only if they commit to being part of the solution," she explained. "Sometimes the people who've been part of the problem have insights we need to fix it, but they'll be held accountable every step of the way." Alicia considered this. "I'm not sure how I feel about that." "That's fair," Tamika said. "And your voice matters in this too. Would you consider joining the partnership? We need people with first-hand experience of these issues." As Alicia tentatively agreed to attend the next meeting, Tamika reflected on how far things had come in just 2 weeks. From a rainy night and an unjust arrest to the beginning of something that might actually create lasting change. The hardest work was still ahead, but a door had been opened that had remained stubbornly shut for too long. Real change, she was learning, rarely came from the top down. It grew from experiences shared, from uncomfortable truths acknowledged, and from people willing to sit at the same table despite their differences, all trying, however imperfectly, to build something better. 6 months later, Tamika stood at the podium in the community center, looking out at the crowd gathered for the first public forum of the Police Community Partnership Council. The room was packed, residents from all neighborhoods, officers in and out of uniform, local officials, and media. The energy was different than it had been half a year ago, less angry, more purposeful. "When I was wrongfully arrested 6 months ago," Tamika began, "I could never have imagined where that night would lead us. What happened to me was not unique. What's unique is what we've done with it." She gestured to the panel seated behind her, a diverse group including community leaders, police representatives, legal experts, and ordinary citizens who had stepped forward to be part of the solution. "Together, we've created something that many said was impossible, a working partnership between law enforcement and the community they serve. Not perfect, not finished, but real. The changes of the past 6 months had been both subtle and profound. The most visible was the new training program for officers, developed by the Council and now mandatory for every member of the force. Instead of the old 2-hour cultural sensitivity seminar, officers now underwent a comprehensive program that included community immersion, scenario-based training led by residents, and ongoing mentorship. Less visible but equally important were the policy changes, new guidelines for traffic stops, clearer accountability measures, and a transparent complaint process that gave citizens real recourse when problems occurred. As Tamika introduced each panel member, she came to Tom Reynolds, the officer who had arrested her that rainy night. No longer in uniform, he now worked full-time with the Council, bringing his insider's knowledge to the reform efforts. Officer Reynolds has shown us that change is possible. Tamika said, not just in systems, but in individuals. His willingness to acknowledge mistakes and work towards solutions has been vital to our progress. Reynolds nodded in acknowledgement, the discomfort of being publicly recognized still visible on his face. He had spent months earning trust, working directly with community members who had experienced police misconduct, listening more than speaking. The transformation hadn't been easy or straightforward, but it had been genuine. After the panel introductions, the forum opened for community questions. A teenage boy was the first to approach the microphone set up in the aisle. "My name's Deshawn, and I live over on Elm Street," he said, his voice cracking slightly with nerves. "Last year, I was scared every time I saw a police car in my neighborhood. Now I recognize Officer Wilson, who patrols our block. He knows my name, helps out with our basketball game sometimes. That's different. But I still see stuff on the news about police problems in other cities. So my question is, how do we make what's happening here happen everywhere?" It was a big question, more complex than anyone in the room could fully answer. Tamika looked to the panel, and Reynolds leaned forward to the microphone. "Deshawn, that's probably the most important question we could be asking," he said. "What we're doing here isn't a quick fix. It's slow, it's sometimes uncomfortable, and it only works because people on both sides decided to stick with it even when it got hard." He glanced at Tamika before continuing. "We're documenting everything, what works, what doesn't, how the training affects real interactions on the street. We're sharing that with departments in other cities. 3 have already sent representatives to observe our program. It spreads one department, one neighborhood, one interaction at a time." As the questions continued, Tamika felt a tap on her shoulder. Lisa, her clerk, handed her a note. "Just got this data from the city manager's office," it read. "Complaints against officers down 62% in past quarter. Community Trust Survey shows positive rating up 28% from last year." Numbers didn't tell the whole story, but they were a concrete measure of progress. Later, when she shared these statistics with the audience, the room burst into applause. After the forum ended, people lingered, breaking into smaller conversations. Tamika found herself standing with a small group that included Alicia, whose testimony at the hearing had been so powerful. "You know what's weird?" Alicia said, "6 months ago, I couldn't have imagined being in the same room with Officer Reynolds without feeling angry. Today, I actually had a normal conversation with him about the youth program at my daughter's school." "Is that a good weird or a bad weird?" Tamika asked. "Good, I think," Alicia replied. "Not that I've forgotten what happened to me. But it feels like that energy is going somewhere useful now, not just burning me up inside." Across the room, Reynolds was speaking with Chief Williams and several other officers. The chief had initially been reluctant about the partnership, concerned about morale and public image. But as the positive results became impossible to ignore, he had become an important ally. Tamika watched as one of the newer officers, a young woman who had graduated from the academy just 2 months ago, asked Reynolds a question. Their interaction reminded Tamika that the next generation of officers would start their careers with a different understanding of their role in the community. That, perhaps, was where the most lasting change would come from. As the evening wound down, Tamika found herself standing outside the community center with Judge Wilson, who had supported her efforts from the beginning. "You've done remarkable work here," Wilson said, looking out at the diverse group of people leaving the building together. Officers and residents, talking casually rather than eyeing each other with suspicion. "It's not just me," Tamika replied. "It's everyone who was willing to stay at the table even when the conversations got difficult." Wilson nodded. "You know, when I first heard about your arrest, I thought this would be a flashpoint, a moment of outrage that would fade like all the others before it. I've never been happier to be wrong." Tamika thought about how close she had come to simply identifying herself that night, to using her position to avoid the experience altogether. How different things might have been if she had. "Sometimes," she said, "justice comes from unexpected places." The next morning, Tamika was back in her courtroom, presiding over cases as she had done for years. But something had shifted, both in how she approached her role and in how others engaged with the court. Officers who testified now seemed more thoughtful in their presentations, more precise in their language, more willing to acknowledge the limitations of their observations. Community members who came before her bench seemed less intimidated by the process, more willing to speak up when they felt something wasn't right. These weren't dramatic changes that would make headlines, but they were real. They were the everyday result of the bridges that had been built over the past 6 months. During the lunch recess, Tamika received a call from the mayor's office. The city council had approved funding to expand the training program to all public-facing city employees, not just police. It was another small victory in what Tamika had come to see as a long-term project of transformation. That evening, she drove home along the same route where she had been stopped 6 months earlier. The neighborhood looked the same houses, same streets, same streetlights that cast their glow on the sidewalks. But it felt different knowing that the officers who now patrolled these streets had gone through training designed by the very community they served. As she pulled into her driveway, Tamika noticed a patrol car slowing down nearby. The officer inside, someone she didn't recognize, gave a respectful nod as he continued his rounds. Not because she was Judge Johnson, but simply because she was a resident of the neighborhood he was there to protect. It wasn't perfect. There would still be difficult days ahead, setbacks and disagreements and moments when it would be tempting to give up on the partnership they built. But tonight, in this small interaction, Tamika saw the first real glimpse of what justice could look like when it was built from understanding rather than fear, from connection rather than division. Sometimes the path to real change begins with a single moment that forces us to see what's been there all along. For Tamika Johnson, that moment had come on a rainy night 6 months ago. And though she would never have chosen the experience, she had chosen what to make of it, not just for herself, but for her entire community. And that perhaps was the greatest justice of all.